Good morning. Welcome. It's so great to see all of you back here this morning. Thank you so much for attending today's International Trade Compliance Series presented by Denton's, Cohen & Grigsby's PC Trade Group. So today's workshop is going to be focused on customs, tariff, engineering, and supply chain planning. So before we begin, I want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording these sessions. I know we might have some people absent since it is Passover and Easter this week. So if you have a colleague who's not able to attend, please let me know and we'll be able to send the replay over to you or over to that person. Again, April 13th is going to be our next session on China. That will not be recorded. So that is one that you want to make sure that you attend in person. So we will be sending a PDF of the slides by the end of the day. If you do not receive it by this evening, please check your spam. And if it's not there, please contact me. And then again, if we do have time for Q&A, we will take questions at the end of the presentation if time allows. Otherwise, you can email me the questions as well, and we can cover those at a future session. Registration for this series will remain open. So if you do have a colleague that wants to attend any of the future events, they are still able to register. And then again, if you have any feedback on this session or any other of the sessions that we held previous to this, please let me know. So now I want to introduce you to two familiar faces. Both of them have been here with us before. So Susanne Cook and Megan Finkelstein, sorry. Megan is a consultant with extensive experience in U.S. Customs and Border Patrol compliance, free trade agreements, trade advisement relative to other U.S. federal agency requirements, foreign customs and export control requirements. Her comprehensive experience spans all aspects of both civil and criminal customs law. And Susanne is a senior partner and chairs the Denton's, Cohen & Grigsby International Business Team. So she's a business and corporate lawyer, focusing her practice on counseling companies on international domestic M&A transactions, joint ventures, emerging business, corporate governance, customs, export, and licensing matters. And at this time, please welcome Susanne.
Good morning. I'm so glad to be here on this nice sunny day in Pittsburgh. And we are focusing today on supply chain planning and impact on customs tariffs. Next slide, please. This is, as you will note, as we go through this series, it's a rather complex topic. And as always, we are attorneys at heart. This is our disclaimer. This is an overview, but we will hopefully get to all the important topics on applying with supply chain demands, and at the same time with a view of how customs tariffs will be affected and maybe give you some planning tools. So next slide, please. This is, and I should have maybe added this picture. Many of you have probably seen it. It's two faces facing each other. And when viewers look at this picture, some see two faces looking at each other and others see a vase. And so this is kind of how this area is. When Megan and I first started talking about it, she said, no, nothing has changed in this area. It's along the same lines, the same constructs. And I said, Megan, but everything has changed. And you will see it's kind of like the two faces in the vase. It's all there. It's all the same, but it's also very, very different. And I think to focus a little bit on why this topic is so much more important than it has ever been, let me just review a little bit where we are right now. In 2020, US exports decreased 16% to 2.1 trillion, still big numbers. Same time, imports decreased 10% to 2.8 trillion. And at the same time, the trade deficit grew 18% to 679 billion. So everything is in motion. When looking around in preparation for this presentation, and generally, we keep track of trade. There's so many articles out there just talking about the supply chain and the changes. And I thought this one, it was the heading of the Wall Street Journal recent article. And it's so true. Everywhere you look, the global supply chain is a mess. And now, next slide, please. And, obviously everybody's asking, what are the causes? Why do we have trouble in our supply chain? And the most common answer currently seems to be COVID. It's all around us, and it's a simple answer. Personally, I think it's more complicated than that, because COVID is just arrived as we already pre-COVID were using trade remedies increasingly. So it's all the perfect storm and overlay. It's just to kind of go through what the trade remedies are that we will be focusing on is there are US ADD CVD cases. Just for those of you, ADD, anti-dumping, means when foreign goods are imported into the United States at a price that is unfair and artificially low, harming US industry. So currently there are a total of 418 ADD and 151 CVD cases active, of which 211 involve China. As you will see throughout this presentation, a lot of these trade remedies, we are targeting China. It's China, China, China. And also there is an increase in these orders. In 2020, 33 new ADD CVD orders in the United States, and in 2021, we are looking already at 19. So there is a tick up in these cases. Then let's look at the Section 301 tariffs, which again, going back to what is it, the two faces or the vase? These tariffs are very new, starting in on July 6, 2018, and have been increased significantly since then, all imposed on China. But it's pursuant to rather old law, the Tariff Act of 1974. And the law to authorize Section 301 tariffs has been there all along. We just haven't used it, but now we do. And it targets unfair trade practices. And it's currently imposed on 550 billion of imports. Pursuant to the Tariff Act of 1974, also there are the Section 201 tariffs, which have increased. I'm not going to focus much on it. It's a smaller subset, and it really is very much in the nature of ADD cases. But of much more significant importance are the Section 232 cases, which target national security of the United States. So basically what we're saying, when we impose these Section 232 tariffs under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, on imports of steel and aluminum, that the United States, for national security reasons, has to maintain its own supply chain of aluminum and steel. And you also hear sometimes, particularly the Europeans, complaining and saying, we are your friends, we're your allies. This is not a national security issue, but it's been upheld. And again, the impact is significant. Lately now, Mexico and Canada was removed from this 232 tariffs. Then the Boeing Airbus dispute, another trade remedy case, which was in front of the World Trade Organization, has been there for 10 years at least. But in October 2019, the United States was authorized to impose Section 301 tariffs on airplane parts and food items. And it's tariffs on goods estimated at 7.5 billion. And all of this, it's a compounding effect of all these trade remedies and disruption in the trade chain, the supply chains. Next slide, please. And it's not just a US trade remedy situation, there's retaliation. How are others responding? Let's take a little bit of a look at that. The European Union also maintains ADD, CVD cases, many against China, but also against other countries. Currently, the European Union is initiating about 40 cases a year, which a decade ago, it was almost a couple of years to initiate 40 cases. Again, there has been an increase in these cases. China is a relative newcomer to ADD, but uses that tool heavily. And as of June 2020, China had initiated 128 ADD cases. And these are just examples. Other countries maintain ADD systems as well. China, in response to the 301 tariffs, imposed on lists 1 through 4A, China imposed tariffs of approximately 245 billion at rates ranging from 5 to 25%. Now, let's look at that number, 245 billion versus the United States had imposed 550 billion under these Section 301 tariffs. So it's not a total tit for tat. And my suspicion is that there's just not that much import versus imports of Chinese goods coming here. So it's much easier for us to get to these bigger numbers. Then in response to the Section 232 tariffs, initially estimated at 43 billion of US exports, other countries implemented their own counter tariffs. And initially estimated, like I said, at 43 billion, which dropped to about 50% of that when we took out Mexico and Canada. The Boeing Airbus dispute, we have a little bit of a standstill right now. The current administration announced a standstill between the US and the EU and the US and the UK. So we have 4 months to negotiate and maybe find a solution to this long-standing dispute. It seems that both parties are really interested in settling this. So there is a good chance that may happen. Then there is this forced labor. It's been a new focus of the United States to look at imports that were manufactured with forced labor, and to basically put a boycott on those imports. As you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to know in each case how these items were manufactured, but the focus seems to be on the Xinjiang province, which is the cotton center in probably the world, cotton center of China, and where the Muslim minority seems to be a part of the labor force that is forced to work in this industry. So any imports from the Xinjiang province are probably suspect at this point. Now, in retaliation to this, China has reacted vehemently, has put some individuals on a no entry list, has really imposed sanctions on Nike and H&M, the UK label. Also, the UK and Canada joined these sanctions. The European Union has not yet, but it's heating up as we speak. And then other, the Suez Canal, that will certainly have an impact on the supply chain, which I'm told it will take many months to unlodge that, because the ripple effect just from one ship, the Ever Given, we will keep seeing supply chain distortions from that one single event. Next slide, please. Now, it's very difficult these days to have a good plan on how to manage your supply chain. As attorneys, we're dealing with supply chain demands differently than we did 5 years ago. For example, I'm working currently on a significant large supply agreement, and we're dealing with the requirements aspect of that contract differently than we would have 5 years ago, really questioning, do we know that we can supply this with 12-month notice? Because everywhere we hear our clients complain that input items that they need for their manufacture that were readily available and could be ordered just on time are now 6, 8, 10 months out. And it's the stories are increasing. While this is not the topic of this today's presentation, I just want to make a quick plug for, please look at your supply agreements and your terms and conditions, and to just with a view at how protected are you if there are supply chain distortions and you cannot deliver on time. Some people think, oh, it's going to be a force majeure. Force majeure is very difficult to implement. So I just a plug, because it's we haven't, I think, seen the peak yet of these supply chain distortions, and contract review with that in mind is a very, very important planning tool. Now, so just if you focus on what are we talking about and what is customs looking at increasingly. First of all, global sourcing, internal communication. As a company, there must be a program in place where the different departments talk to each other about supply chain. If procurement just simply changes a vendor, that could have severe effects down the supply chain, and everybody in the company needs to understand what the implications could be. The review of anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, does it apply to your product or to an input item? We still see sometimes surprises where companies are surprised that an import that they are working on is so affected. Section 301 duties also, we have seen mostly on products of China where companies were surprised, and 25% additional duties, that's serious money. It also, these Section 301s are imposed under the Boeing case on airplane parts and certain food items. Section 201 duties, Section 232 duties on steel and aluminum, and customs focuses on that because they understand that if there is an error in any of these entries, it involves big sums of money immediately. other enforcement priorities and where you might see increase CF28, which is a request from customs, or CF29 activity, CF29 being when customs has made a decision dealing with forced labor. So, you know, any cotton items, for example, coming imported from China would be a target here. Textiles generally always, agriculture and quotas. Intellectual property rights are much more under scrutiny. Any imports or transactions involving trade agreements, revenue cases. Again, that's why all these other items here are of such interest, because at 25% duty, you know, the revenue is pretty high immediately. And then import safety, like consumer items, where the safety requirements of these items are being scrutinized. And now let me turn over the presentation to my colleague and friend, Megan.
Thanks, Susanna. Good morning, everyone. So nice to have everyone back with us. And yeah, I'm going to delve a little more into some of the different options that may be available to your company, depending on the type of business you do and the type of structuring that you're able to bring about. But wanted to start out with the key elements to everything that we're going to talk about today. We spent some time in January at our first session on harmonized tariff classification, and can't speak to that enough, because everything that we're going to talk about today is going to hinge on your classification as well as the country of origin. You know, the classification, again, we spent, you know, a long time talking about, but it's every word that goes into the headings and your subheadings. Every word has a meaning in the classification system. And it's almost like, I like to compare it to a big puzzle, where sometimes we think we take the puzzle, but we just start at the outside and we put all the edges and those are the rules. But with customs classification, that isn't the case. We sometimes that's the rules where we're filling on the edge, but everything in the middle has some ambiguity. So we really do have to look at what every word, you know, every tariff word has a meaning, as well as looking at definitions in the chapters and the section notes and the explanatory notes and, you know, the rulings before the Court of International Trade. All of these have a really significant impact on classification, and all of the strategies that we'll talk about this morning will hinge on your classification, because if you have the wrong classification, it's going to likely throw you out or potentially throw you out of a provision that you may be eligible for. Country of origin, the same, really important. Susanna talked about the coordination between companies, internal communication, rather, that you may have engineers who are sourcing something in one country but don't tell procurement, and that could, you know, throw off your analysis of when you're looking at free trade agreements, whether you're looking at getting a binding ruling for some tariff restructuring. Regardless, you know, just keeping everyone on the same page as to where you're sourcing things. It sounds easy that, you know, of course everyone would know that, but we see that very frequently, that in the supply chain things change and the communication just isn't kind of forwarded along. The other thing that's not on the screen that I will probably talk about or keep repeating is record keeping. All of the programs that we're going to talk about this morning and the options have significant record keeping with customs. As Susanna had said, with, you know, the two faces, like she was saying, I really do see that as this has always been the case, and this is what customs has always looked at, but the scrutiny is much, much higher now. And so the record keeping and documentation is much more significant, because customs is asking more questions and targeting much more. So yes, and on my side of that, you know, it is still the same. It's the same qualifications. Nothing's really changed, but definitely the significance and the increased scrutiny is much more significant. So totally on Susanna's side, probably 75%, I'd say I'd go. Next screen, please. So these are the supply chain planning and opportunities that we're going to discuss this morning. The first one, tariff restructuring, which is really significant, again, has been around a long time, but is really more significant now with customs being much more scrutinizing anti-dumping, the Section 301s, the 232s. There's a lot more on the table where companies have abilities to maybe manufacture more, manufacture less, changing the substantial transformation where you may have a part or an assembly and you just add a little bit more to it that could change it from a part into a final product that may throw you out or in to one of the other provisions. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail on that, as well as valuation structure, first sale, which is available to companies a lot of times in textiles. Susanne is going to talk about that a little bit later because there's been some recent development, very structure specific, but a very good avenue if you meet those criteria. We'll spend a little time on the free trade agreements, particularly with USMCA now being enforced. That's really thrown a stone into a lot of things that we're seeing, whereas some of the strategies that I'll talk about this morning are available to certain countries and certain free trade agreements, oftentimes are different with USMCA. So definitely something to keep in mind when we're talking export. When you export to a free trade country, isn't always necessarily the same as an export to other countries. Bonded warehouses we'll talk about, which is a good option if your company deals in certain things and for exporters as well. Free trade zones, kind of similar to bonded warehouses, but have some different twists to them. The available of duty drawback if you are an exporter or you're importing things that you then do want to turn around and export versus because they're, don't meet the requirements or they're not sold. That's a nice opportunity. And then things that are in Chapter 98 of the tariff, the primary one that we see is a temporary import under bond, the TIB provisions that are very beneficial, for restructuring your 301s and the 232s if you're doing some sort of manufacturing or processing here. So we'll get a little bit more into that. And Susanne is going to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about some of the recent developments and the trends in some of these areas as well. Next screen, please. So we're going to start out with the supply chain restructuring, like I said, that, tariff restructuring. And it's a legal restructuring. A lot of times when we'll say that, oh, maybe we can restructure something, people think, oh, we're doing it wrong. And that's certainly not the case. There are a number of different ways that you can restructure depending on your classification, depending on the type of business you do. If you are doing some manufacturing, if you're able to increase some parts, take some parts out. If you have a relationship with your supplier, that they're able to do that. So maybe you're able to source certain parts and they're able to source other parts from different countries that might change your country of origin. So might alleviate, if you're dealing in China, some of the 301 tariffs. So really it's kind of going from if you have a finished good to sometimes sub-assemblies to sometimes parts. And based on the classification and based on what some of these new issues coming up with the 232s and 301s based on classification or based on product specific descriptions really may pull you in or out of some of these programs. An example is, on air conditioners, we've seen and studied a lot that the full air conditioner is a 301, so you're at the 25%. But you may have options dealing with your supplier that perhaps they can manufacture parts. And some of these parts can be considered sub-assemblies. It really depends, again, going back to our discussion on classification. So you may be able to import sub-assemblies or parts, maybe do some minor assembly or more complex assembly here in the United States manufacturing, where you could then assemble a unit. And Susanne is going to talk more in detail later, but a critical part here is having a binding ruling from customs. And this is where we get into the two faces as well, because binding rulings have always been around with customs. And sometimes we advise our clients to get them and sometimes we don't. It kind of is dependent on what, again, if it's a prospective shipment versus if it's not, because timing is an issue. But as well as sometimes once customs gives you the ruling, you have to follow what they say. So some of our clients are comfortable with what they're doing and don't really want because they're able to substantiate what they're doing, but others do not. But today, with the increased scrutiny, it is more important than ever to get a ruling because there are so many considerations. The look-through rule, with the anti-dumping and countervailing duty, again, has been around for some products. The customs now is moving forward to looking at much more in detail with even assemblies, not just a certain product, but overall looking across. So it's not only with customs determinations, but even with the Department of Commerce with scope determinations. if you're dealing with a product, for example, solar panels. If you're bringing in products that have a solar panel, Commerce has always had this look-through rule. Oh, I'm sorry, can you jump back? Can you go to the last screen, please? I'm sorry, if you could just back up one. Perfect, perfect, thank you. So oftentimes the, I'm sorry, up one. Next one, please. Let me go to the next screen, please. Perfect, thank you. So there may be some opportunities too with the scope determinations that you would want to take a look and perhaps go to Commerce and get a ruling. Could you go back to the last screen, please? I'm sorry, we're having some tech issues. Right there's perfect. Okay. Also, just to get through this quickly, the sourcing alternatives as well, like I had already kind of focused on, you may be able to have your vendors source from different countries, perhaps in the air conditioning example where maybe there's a compressor, which is pretty important component of the air conditioning, but maybe you can source that from another country where it would substantially transform the country of origin of the product, which again, with the customs rulings, customs will rule on that, whether they could say the country of origin is China, or perhaps the country of origin is Thailand, which would have an effect on the 301s that you would be paying. And again, the communication, is really important here as well, because once you have a ruling or once you have your plan down, if the country of origin starts changing or the different parts start changing, that could throw your entire analysis off and either, put you in a situation where you're subject to these additional duties or even regular duties based on the classification, or take you out of those. Next screen, please. So these are some of the ways, depending on substantial transformation in the country of origin, again, on non-free trade agreements, and we talked earlier with the USMCA, this can become very different, a very different analysis. And they're all very case specific. To be a substantially transformed article, basically the definition is it has to be a new and different article and has to come out with a new name, a new character, and a new use. Definitely it's helpful to have a new HTS tariff classification as well, but isn't always the case. Country of origin definitions is defined as we're saying country of origin, it's the manufacture, the growth, and production of any foreign article entering the US. This definition also differs when we get to the free trade agreement countries. So considerations that you want to look at, because it is very case by case specific, just one of these items will not make it substantially transformed or otherwise. So the bill of materials, if you're looking at each component is really important to look at. What's the essential character of it? What's the value of it? What's its purpose? What's its use? What's its tariff number? Is there any sort of change in the shape or the form that you adding this component in would change your product? And if some of these intermediate parts can be sold as well, so if you have a set sub-assemblies that you can sell, you don't sell as long as the product, that's something that sometimes that we'll see in with customs that they'll look at, that if you are selling it as an intermediate, that kind of can hurt your argument a bit as well. And we talked a little, like I said, with the look-through rule in the Section 301 considerations, certain items customs has, there are probably 8 or 9 anti-dumping countervailing duty cases out here where they specifically look at the look-through. So solar panels being one, if you have that in a product, that's something that just because you are trying to outsource it, customs is still going to take that as an anti-dumping. They're not going to consider that substantially transformed. Next screen, please. And these are some really specific questions to ask yourself about substantial transformation. Again, is something wholly manufactured, produced, or grown in one country? What we'd want to look at, for the determination is, are there multiple countries that are involved? Where are the main parts coming from? What is the purpose of the main parts? And sometimes even minor parts may not seem important, but they may have a really significant value. So those will come into play. And then we want to look at the country of export as well. Where is it being exported from? This is the question that we get a lot where people say, well, it's not exported from China, so are we okay? And that is not the case. It's the country of origin. It's not necessarily the country of export. Substantial transformation, asking yourself, is it the country of export again? Is it another country? Looking at all the bills of material. And binding rulings, like I said, really, really good, really important now in today's environment than ever before. Has always been a good tool, but something that we definitely weigh much more heavy. And it's really the way you structure these binding rulings. We see a lot where, they're just input and people say, this is what we have. It's actually to your benefit when there is a little ambiguity, like I said, in that whole puzzle with the classification, where there's some ambiguity to those puzzle pieces in the middle, and it gives us a better argument for guidance that we really want to portray to customs what the answer we want, not necessarily saying, hey, this is what we have, ABC, this is our bill of material, these are all the values. We want to kind of influence them into the decision that we are really looking for. In the free trade agreements, we currently have approximately 20 countries with 14 different agreements. Next screen, please. So here are a list of them. They seem to be growing. They weren't as growing as much with the last administration, but definitely I think we'll probably see that swinging back. So I do seem to think that we're going to see that increasing. Specifically, like I said, the requirements are very, very different in each free trade agreement, particularly with USMCA, with the strategies that we're talking about. And all of these countries have different tweaks. They also have different requirements coming in. Some of them have a specific form. Some of them just have a certificate. But again, where we talked about record keeping is very, very key, just overall in compliance with the free trade agreements, because they're all very different and they all have very different criteria. Next screen, please. So some of the considerations when we're dealing with the free trade agreements, again, are the eligibility, because a lot of them go into tariff classification, whether it's the classification or whether it's a regional value content, depending on what the criteria are to be eligible for the program. Documentation and classification, which I said is so essential with these free trade agreements, because if you start out with the wrong classification, you very likely may be just totally thrown out of the ballgame altogether. Country of origin and the country of origin marking rules all differ as well with each free trade agreement. So you kind of need to really read the rules for each one and make sure that you're in the right division. All the programs are different as well. Some of them require just a tariff shift. So if you have an item in it that is non-originating, those are the items that you look at in a free trade agreement in your article, in your product, to see whether it meets the tariff shift, whether it's allowed, it's not allowed. The regional value content, sometimes the rule will tell you it's basically, you kind of have to follow the rules with these. And sometimes it'll be a little bit of both. There are some de minimis rules, but again, they're all very specific to each agreement. But a great program if you're dealing in any of these countries that have free trade agreements. Great opportunity, and we'll have a chart at the end showing that some of them were beneficial to avoiding the 301s and the 232s and with exports, and some are a little tougher, particularly with the USMCA. Substantial transformation, again, is different depending on the agreement that you're dealing with, and different than a basic substantial transformation that we're dealing with when we're talking about imports from other countries. Customs does offer rulings, though, on free trade agreements and country of origin, so it's again another good avenue to approach. Next screen, please. So bond and warehouses is the next area that we're going to talk about, and this is really specific to a lot of the way you do your business and the way you want to propose to your business, but it's a good global strategy to look at if you're trying to avoid paying duties altogether if you're going to import and then export, but also if you have sales that you're just not quite ready to, you're not bringing them in and selling them right away. So you may want to hold them for a while, or you may be doing some manipulation to them. So depending on your circumstances, it really does give you somewhat of a safe haven for a temporary basis anyway, to not be able to pay the duty. So it's a specific entry type where it comes into a bonded warehouse. A bonded warehouse can be a public warehouse that's bonded, or you can privately apply for application of your own. So no duties are paid when you enter the warehouse. Once it's there, there are 11 different types of warehouses. The most common are manipulation, storage, and manufacturing, and they all have different criteria. They can remain in a bonded warehouse for up to 5 years. So if you are bringing a good in and you're doing things with it, but you maybe things are under quota, or maybe there are Section 301s that you just don't have the sales for yet, but you want to hold off and not pay them yet. So it's kind of a time saving as well. Again, public warehouses or your own, they do take about a 6-month application period for approval if you're looking for your own facility, but both options are there. The Section 232s we've seen that have been useful to some of our clients, where they've submitted the application, but the time frame, which we're hoping will change, that will be more efficient and quicker, but the passage is not. And so we've had clients that wanted to just keep their goods in the warehouse, waiting to see if they got approved for the 232. And if they didn't get approved, their global supply allowed them to then export it. So they decided they didn't want to enter the goods. So it kind of can be a waiting period, like kind of a holding pattern as well. But definitely is a way that you'd structure your sales and your payments. So it's a good opportunity for some, but definitely depending on how you structure it, the bonded warehouses could be a good option. Next screen, please. Foreign trade zones, another option, both importer and exporter benefits. Kind of similar in a way to bonded warehouses, but have different elements and different structure. When things go into the zone, there's no duties paid, but you really want to do a lot of planning with free trade zones, because it depends how you enter your goods into the zone. You can enter both foreign and domestic goods into a zone, and you can determine the eligibility too when you take it out, whether you want the duty to be paid on goods going in, or whether you want it as a final product substantially transformed being exported from a zone. Very specific, and they define that as privileged or non-privileged status of goods going into the zone. It's, again, as the same with the bonded warehouse. When you export a good, it has more benefits regarding the 232s and 301s, because you're able to export it, and with the anti-dumping as well, out of the country, not to, again, the foreign trade countries in the USMCA necessarily, but export it without paying those duties. It's a little bit different when you manufacture a product, when you have goods that are set under the 232 and 301s that you're going to use for domestic sales in the US or to the USMCA, Mexico or Canada, because those you end up with the US domestic sales, you end up paying the 232s and 301s when they come out of the zone. So again, you delay it, very kind of similar to the bonded warehouse, but they're delayed, but you still end up paying those. And it's kind of up in the air with the USMCA how that goes. We're actually involved right now with customs on this, whether the 301s are applicable when they're going to a USMCA country, but that's kind of to stay tuned. So again, it's a really good opportunity if you're exporting, but something you really need to examine if you are delaying it and it's going to be then brought into the US. Subzones can be, you can rent space within a zone, which is a much quicker way to do it, but you also can apply for your own program and have your own zone territory in your own facility or in a different warehouse. Timeline takes about 5 to 12 months, so a little more restrictive and a little bit more planning that goes into that, but a really good program depending on how your business is structured. Next screen, please. Another option with drawback, again, if you're an exporter and you're bringing goods in and you know that some may be shipped out, drawback is a great program. You only get 99% of the duties that back. Also is a decent program if you have goods coming in that you just don't end up using, or that you are damaged or not good, because, you know, we often hear complaints from clients that they say, well, you know, goods come in, it's not our fault that they're destroyed. You know, next time they bring a shipment in and they, you know, they don't pay they don't want to pay the duties because they come in duty free because they've been damaged. Well, customs doesn't agree with that. If you don't do a drawback and you don't export goods that should have been destroyed or that weren't good enough, they're still going to charge you the duty. So drawback is a good option there, where you get 99% of your duties back. Documentation is really important, because there are certain drawback centers that do these special drawback entries, and they're very specific in the planning and their auditing. You can do same condition drawback, which is very common and not nearly as complex. Or there's a manufacturing drawback, which is similar to the bonded warehousing, where you bring goods into a warehouse, you do some manufacturing on them, and then you send them out, where you get these duties back. They're a lot more specific. You have to either have a general manufacturing drawback ruling, which generally is about a 90-day approval, but it's kind of more generic terms, more simplified manufacturing, where there's specific manufacturing drawback rulings, which take about a year or two to get approved, and they're very case specific. And you have to, in these cases, also account for your waste and things that you're doing in manufacturing, because these things all kind of counteract. You just don't bring things in, manufacture, and ship them out. The drawback rules are very specific to waste and how you're either bring that out and paying duties on, or shipping them out. So it's a fairly complex situation, but again, very beneficial if this is the kind of structuring that you can do. Next screen, please. And TIBs, temporary import under bonds. Again, a good program depending on how you structure your business. It's a special entry that you bring goods in. They cannot be for sale in the United States. You have to already have a contract for sale of these goods. So you bring them in, you have them in a warehouse, you may manufacture them into something else, you may put a good into something else. It has to either be entered for repair, alteration, or processing. And there is some flexibility in that, because since the processing sometimes can be manufactured into another product, considered US product. But again, where we talked about rulings earlier, this is where rulings really come into play to see if something qualifies for a TIB. A TIB has to be closed out though. So when you bring it in, and you have to file the TIB entry at the time you import into the United States. It's not something that you can bring it in and then say, oh, I'm going to change this to a TIB. You have to have this, and you have to know ahead of time. And then you have to close the TIB out. So every product that comes in has to go out, and you have to have specific record keeping that keeps to that. So a great program, but not such a great program if you end up not being able to close your TIB out with the exact amounts going out. So liquidated damages can be fairly significant. And that's why, again, the documentation is really key on these programs. But again, very good if you're exporting and you had 301s and the 232s, they come in, you process, they ship out, you don't end up paying 232s or the 301s. Under the USMCA, again, a different situation. And that's what, you know, like I said, we're kind of in the midst with customs right now on this, where it's a very significant fact, because with USMCA changing, we're no longer really sure on TIBs whether those 301s end up being paid under NAFTA duty deferral program. So that's kind of a stay tuned as well. But you know, for basic exports, it's a pretty good opportunity. But again, never hurts to have that ruling. Next screen, please. So this is kind of an overview of the tables to kind of just show the different programs that are available, and then the 232s, the 301s, and the anti-dumping. With the bonded warehouse, just for review, you don't pay any of the 232s, the 301s, or the anti-dumpings on imports. And if you export to a regular country that's not a free trade agreement or USMCA, there's no payment. There's no 232s, 301s, or regular duty payments for that matter. Under the trade zone, a little bit different depending on whether you're exporting it into commerce into the United States, or whether it's export to another country. Export to another country, again, you're not paying the 232s, 301s, or the anti-dumping. If you're entering them into the commerce of the US, you will pay based on the status being considered a privileged foreign status, you will have to pay the duties on those parts. USMCA, again, big question mark for trade zones as well as the TIBs that we're staying tuned on, and we believe that, particularly on the TIBs, that it's not due, but we'll see how that goes. Duty drawback, this is where it's very significantly different. The Section 232s are not eligible for duty drawback. There have been some court actions on that, and that people have argued that could be overturned, but I do not see that happening for some reason. The way it was said in the proclamation, the 232s are not eligible for drawback. Section 301s are. Anti-dumping and countervailing duty are not eligible for drawback. And under the TIBs, the same, as long as the TIB conditions are met, which again is really key on the conditions because of liquidated damages on TIB entries. The only issues with those, with the 232s and the 301s, other than the USMCA, is that your bond amount will be increased. So if you have to increase your bond, you may get into a bond stacking situation where if your entries don't liquidate, where your bond then may be an outstanding higher amount. So that's a consideration, but definitely when your TIBs are done correctly, and these entries normally liquidate. When you get into anti-dumping, sometimes you get into areas where the liquidation stays open for a long time, so the bonds issues become bigger, but in liquidated entries generally don't. So generally some good options. I am going, next screen, please. I'm going to pass this over back to Susanne, and she'll take it from here.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, as Megan mentioned throughout, and we kind of coordinated that with each other, that since binding rulings are so important, we wanted to mention the importance of these rulings throughout the presentation, because as we showed with the duties that are on the table, many 25% duties, ADD duties can be 200, 300%. The repercussions if you are wrong are significant. So to have the surety that yes, this is binding, and customs gives you the advice that you need to move ahead with certainty. And that's really this binding ruling internal advice system. What's the difference between a binding ruling and an internal advice? Internal advice is when you are already importing the items, so it's something in progress, or if it's prospective, then you can get a binding ruling, but it takes planning. So you need at least 30 days, though this is not binding on customs. It's advertised. Customs on their website posts that they will normally respond within 30 days. But we have seen certainly cases that can go much longer than that. We have one right now that's out like 180 days, but it's special circumstances. But these things are sometimes hard to predict. So yes, planning, advanced planning is absolutely critical. Most customs submissions these days are electronic, and so you can submit most binding ruling requests electronically, and actually it's preferred. And there is this transition at customs right now where some of the regulations haven't caught up yet. And some of the regulations still require paper filings and have not adjusted that the submissions are now electronic. So we're in this interim stage, but customs actually has told us and sometimes directed us to file electronically. It's their preferred manner of dealing with things. Now, internal advice, it's current shipments. But then there's no timeline guidance, and they can be out there for a year, 2 years, like we said, months to years. There is some structuring that you might be able to do if, for example, a item is already being imported, but you now have a new model. So I would use that to say this is prospectively, and ask for binding ruling saying this is a model that we've never imported before. So there are some tools that can be done. The submission of a ruling request or internal advice should be taken seriously, because this is your best shot to ask for what you want the answer to be. And like a court brief, you would want to put your best face forward and make the best arguments. In preparation for binding rulings, it's critical to have reviewed what's out there. How has customs ruled on similar matters before, and argue accordingly with prior cases, sometimes citations, etc. I think it really pays off to put a little more attention and time into the preparation of binding rulings. Next slide, please. And now let's move on to some new developments. This is new. And we all in the trade group at Denton, Scone and Grigsby agree that these are new, and these are significant developments, two in particular that I will focus on. Depending on the industry you're in, it could have a huge impact. Pipe spools. I did not, when I first heard the word, it wasn't that meaningful to me, but it has become very meaningful. And pipe spools can be, it's just an assortment of piping systems. It can be pipes, flanges, elbows, fittings. They come in all kinds of sizes. Some of them can be like my room, multiple times of my room, or they could be a component that is put into, let's say, a furnace. They come usually disassembled, or semi-assembled, and this is where it gets tricky. What is when is an assembly? A component of what it is, like a part of a furnace, and when is it a pipe spool? We don't really, since this is so new and just was guidance that came out last year, at the end of last year, I think there will be some litigation, and some of these overlap cases, I think, have to be resolved in court. Right now, customs tells us that if you're importing a pipe spool, and it's clear if it's just a box full of stuff and nothing is yet put together, I think that's a pipe spool, that each individual component is subject to these applicable ADD, CVD, Section 232 and Section 301. And again, at the numbers that we're talking about in ADD cases, CVD cases, and these 25% duties, this is significant, but it's not just a duty payment issue. Money matters, but it's also a record keeping matter. Next slide, please. This is the segment from the notice, customs notification, just an example of what would be required. In this case, we have on the left 3 line items. The one item, the first, is a pipe from Germany. The second is a pipe from Mexico, and then a flange from Italy. They're all imported in a box. And customs wants to see this kind of information on each of the items. we can see that the pipe is classified as 7304191020, and the 99038001 number is a section 301 number, so it's subject to section 301 duties at 25%. And in this case, customs would expect to see the tender of the 25%. The line item number 3 shows a flange. It's classified as 7304191020. It would be subject also to an ADD ruling, and the number is given, the A4758. And this ADD ruling is subject to a rate of 79.17%. Also, there is the section 301 duty at 25%. So, but it's not just a matter of the tender of the additional duties, but it's also steel import licenses must be maintained and presented. Last section. It's a very complicated, you can imagine if you have a huge pipe spool the size of a room with hundreds of pieces of pipe, the exporter and then the importer need to keep track of the source of each of these items, maintain steel import licenses, know the country of origin. It's a significant burden on companies caught in this situation. We call it like the look-through rule. We are not looking at what the end item is, which is sometimes a customs classification system where items are imported and they're classified in accordance with what they are given the entirety. Here we are looking through at each of the subcomponent. Next slide, please. And really what is concerning is we don't know where this will end. It's always been the case that there are some ADD rulings where look-through has been applied, but then the ADD rule is written that way. For example, solar panels have been subject to ADD, and look-through has been applied to solar panels for many years, forever. The order was written that way, so there is predictability and companies know when this will apply. There are now third country ADD case numbers, but with respect to the section 232 and 301s, there is no order in that sense, where we are told, yes, this item subject to section 301 or 232 is always subject to a look-through. So it really will, I believe, ultimately depend upon the state of assembly or disassembly at the time of importation. And you can see where the importer and customs made us sometimes disagree on where things fall, in which case it would have to be taken to the ITC to be resolved there. Again, binding rulings are so important in this situation. If you need the predictability or want the predictability, how will customs treat this item? Will it treat it as the entirety, the end item, because it's assembled sufficiently to be classified as that and treated as that? Or is this a pipe spool where we look at all individual pieces? Next slide, please. There are also compliance considerations, because customs put out another notice where it said, since we did not have the system in place in ACE to have all these different requirements entered into ACE, the pipe spool subassembly information, we are now giving companies the opportunity to come clean and report and fix the ACE entries. It's really a prior disclosure with voluntary tender. And I'm, customs impose this time limit. I'm not sure that one couldn't do a prior disclosure afterwards, but still, I mean, it's already passed. So anyway, it's also, we're wondering what's next. Will this continue to expand? Next slide, please. This is the first sale valuation structure. Also, it's been in place. Again, what is it? The two faces of the vase. It's been in place forever. But there's been a recent court case which kind of threw things up in the air again. It's a first sale valuation structure is used in a multi-tiered supply chain transaction, mostly for textile, where a manufacturer middlemen are outside of the United States and the importer is in the United States. And at the time of the sale between the manufacturer and the middleman, it's clear that this item is destined to the United States and the importer has already, the US importer has already been identified. When all the requirements are met, the importer in the United States pays duty on the manufacturer's price to the middleman at a great customs savings. It's also applicable to assists, subsequent proceeds, but it would obviously be a lesser price than the price at the next chain. But it has to be a bona fide sale. And now we have this Maya Corporation v. US court case where it was held that this first sale valuation structure is not applicable to non-market economies. Again, it's new. There are all kinds of commentaries there wondering, is the first sale valuation structure still applicable? Is it not? Ultimately, I believe it is. It may have just been a isolated case. However, I would believe that there might be an appeal to this case. So it throws things up in the air a little bit, mostly applicable, as I said, to textile companies. Next slide, please. And this is just kind of our overview. There is a lot of scrutiny here, the tools that we talked about today, but the rewards can be significant because duty rates have been increased. This is the first time we gave this particular seminar. We've always, worked in these areas. We've always advised companies in these areas, but given the increased numbers, the increased tariffs, and the risks associated with that and the costs, I believe, this may be part of our standard seminars. It's just very important to assist companies with how to plan supply chains. And again, what's involved? Review HTS classification and country of origin. This is the step one: garbage in, garbage out. You may have everything else, all your analysis may be accurate. If you have a wrong HTS classification, everything else that follows would then likely be wrong. Review your current supply chain logistics where duty reduction deferral may be applicable. I think actually it's good to do this periodically, to just take time occasionally to review your supply chain and see if there's some tweaking that should take place. Review sourcing strategies along with HTS classification to ensure Section 232, 301, and ADD, CVD strategies are met. Again and again, we come across cases where somebody gets blindsided and all of a sudden is faced with these very, very significant high duties. Conduct FTA analysis when applicable. Again, consider binding ruling internal advice. And most important, maintain written documentation and records. The standard is reasonable care. And if challenged, you want to say, no, I acted reasonably. I took reasonable care in my decision-making here. And a couple of years later, when questioned, it's good to have that in writing because we all forget. And thank you very much. This is, next slide is our take on supply chain. And thank you, Monica.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I see a very informative, thank you.
I know, I feel bad. We threw so much information
Well,
out.
this is great though. I love it. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, well then I guess that concludes our program for today. So we're back, what, April the 13th with our session on China, which is going to be at 8:30 Eastern Daylight Time in the morning. So I'll send you a reminder, but make sure that you do adjust to that time because we will have a colleague calling in from Shanghai, right?
Yes, yes. We're all very excited.
Absolutely.
So, yes, have a truly international event.
Yes, definitely. So I will send out the slides for this. And then if anyone has any questions, feel free to email them. Oh, I see something coming in. Oh, Taylor saying it also starts at 8:30 a.m. Thank you, Taylor. Yeah, so that concludes today's session. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.